Can you hear me at the back? All right. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. You've brought me well outside my comfort zone, but it's nevertheless very pleasant and very interesting to be here at this fantastic meeting. I'd like to thank all of these people who've really helped or in fact done all of the work I'm going to talk to you about. And the key word really for my talk is going to be sense of agency. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what that might be, how we can attempt to address it scientifically, and then how it might be relevant to our theme of violence. So when I talk about sense of agency, I'm defining this as an experience, so it's something psychological. It's the experience of controlling one's own actions. By that I mean one's movements of one's body, the contraction of one's muscles, and through them, external events. So every time that you switch on the lights go on and you feel that you're controlling your life, then you'll have a sense of agency. So we have a sense of agency really all the time. Everything that we do is built around this kind of chain where we develop plans or have intentions. You can think about different ways of how our agentic actions start. We've used the word volition, which is a word I think we can use also in this context. So we plan and intend our actions. Our actions involve movements of our body, and we make these movements of our bodies in order to achieve a particular outcome. There are things we want to do. I want the lights to go on because I want to read my book. So this is the structure of our lives, is really our agency. And I'm going to use the term agency to refer specifically to the link between what I do and the outcome. So I would say that volition is the process of making my body move, and agency is the process of acquiring the ability to control the external world through my voluntary actions. Now, just to give you a summary of what I'm going to try and say in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about why agency is a societal as well as a psychological thing. I'm going to emphasize measurement. So in psychology, we don't like to talk about things unless we can at least try to measure them. And I will be discussing some implicit ways of measuring agency. It's not a very good idea to ask people to make explicit judgments of agency. If I say to you, did you do that? There are lots of reasons why I might not believe your answer, right? Like you might be trying to hide something. So we prefer implicit measures, and I'll talk at the end about the relation of these implicit measures of agency to things like freedom, coercion, valence, value, and violence. Okay, so why should we care about agency as a society? Well, agency is ubiquitous. So if you look around you now, everything that you see has been made by a human being, with the possible exception of the sun, which actually I cannot quite see, even if I stand as tall as I can. So, buildings, clothes, technology, agriculture, all of these things which are fundamental to human existence, they are all products of human agency. And I think that unless we had an experience of linking what we do to what happens, action and outcome, putting seeds in the ground, harvesting crops, unless we had that experience of linkage between action and outcome, we wouldn't have anything like the civilization that we have today. So I think the sense of agency is part of our cognitive evolution. The other interesting thing about human agency is it's not quite omnipotent, but it's almost omnipotent. There are lots and lots of things that the human mind can do. There are lots of outcomes that we can produce, okay? Compared to an animal might be able to make a nest, but it can't make the Eiffel Tower or a Beethoven sonata or all the other things that we might be able to do. Now, this is interesting because it's actually a social problem. So there are lots of things that you could do right now. It's really difficult for me to predict what they are, and that could be quite tricky. So it needs social management. The range of different actions that we can achieve need management. One way that this is managed is through culture. So our sense of agency can be conditioned by society through culture. And this is one way of managing the risks associated with the fact that there are so many different actions and outcomes that you could achieve, many of which impinge on me. Now, why do we have a sense of agency? Well, normally in psychology, we think about agency in terms of the rat in the Skinner box. And the dominant way that we think about agency is as instrumentality. So our sense of agency is linked to our ability to produce things that we want. So this rat is prepared to press levers in order to get food, and it wants food. And what I've been thinking about or what I would like to try to develop as my argument in the rest of the talk is that there are two other components of human sense of agency, I don't know about rats, which are underappreciated, understudied, potentially important, and potentially relevant to our topic of violence. And they are the epistemic component of agency and the affective component of agency. So we know that agency brings rewards. We know that if we can build a house, we will stay dry. If we plant crops, we will eat. We know that we can manage our primary needs through instrumentality. But in addition, it seems to me that when we act and we change the world, we produce outcomes, we're also doing something cognitive or epistemic. We're understanding the world around us as well as harvesting it. And finally, the other thing which is quite interesting is people actually like being agentic. There's an affective value to agency by itself. So if you give people a choice between two different actions, one of which produces an outcome of no value whatsoever, and one of which does not, people prefer actions which produce outcomes. There's something intrinsically rewarding just about changing the world. Now, these two latter facts, I think, are underestimated in their importance, and I think they're rather key to explaining how agentic we are. So just to summarize then, the sense of agency is the main topic, but I want to urge that it's linked both to understanding and affect. And this maps, interestingly perhaps, onto the three divisions that we've already heard about today in the frontal and prefrontal cortex. So first of all, what's the epistemic concept of agency? Well, this is very briefly the kind of rather dull experiment that we do in the experimental psychology lab. You can press a button with your right index finger and it produces a particular flash and a particular tone, or with your left index finger and it produces a different flash and a different tone. And you learn these associations. And then in a test phase, you can choose which button you press, and in this case the person's chosen to press with their left hand. And when they press with their left hand, they get the same flash and the same tone, now offset by a particular delay, and they have to say whether the flash and the tone occur simultaneously or successively. Okay? Do the two things happen at the same time? And if you look here, this is the probability that you say these things happened at the same time. And what you can see is that when the things that you present are exactly the learned outcomes of your agency in the learning phase, so pink and fast oscillating tone, then this is what's called the congruent outcome. You are rather willing to perceive simultaneity even when the lag between the audio and the visual stimulus is increased. You tend to perceive these things as co-occurring in time even when they're not, because they were joint outcomes of your action in the previous phase. If you look at a situation where you press with your left hand, and now you get the flash and the sound which were previously associated with the right, this is what's called the incongruent pair. And for the incongruent pair, you're rather likely to perceive these things as happening at different times. You're rather likely to perceive them as being separable. So what does this mean? It means that when you learn a relation between an action and this dual outcome, you integrate the two parts of the outcome. You perceive them as linked. Not only do you produce these outcomes in the world, but you integrate the world to make that into a coherent whole. So in that sense, the fact of being the agent has structured your understanding of what happens in the external world. It's an epistemic effect of being an agent as well as an instrumental effect. You just change what you perceive when you create it. Okay, I now want to get on to the second part of the talk, which is the question about how are we going to measure the sense of agency? How can we actually try to capture what it feels like to control events in the external world? And I've been developing for a while the idea that we can use time perception, and in particular the temporal linkage between the perceived time that we press a button and the perceived time that we hear a tone, very, very simple laboratory example, as a proxy measure for feeling a sense of agency. So we're working in a tradition which goes back to the 19th century work of Helmholtz and Wundt and is called mental chronometry. We're studying what is represented and how it's represented by asking when experiences happen. Okay, it's an old tradition in psychology. This is based on the Libet experiment, but it's not actually asking the same questions. So we have in this experiment a rotating clock, and for those of you who are observant, you'll see that it's a clock with only one hand. You can't animate its rotation in PowerPoint, but it goes around every 2,560 milliseconds. And it's just there for you to say when you have particular experiences. The second part of this experiment is that we're going to invite people to press this button, and the instruction's bizarre. The instruction is press the button when you feel like it. Okay? So not when anything happens, not when the clock gets to 60 or 30, but when you want to. And that's supposed to link to the volitional basis of agency. So the person presses the button, the clock hand continues to rotate. There is then a beep, which I'll describe. I should have had my volume on and you would have heard it, but imagine that you produce a beep. And the beep always occurs 250 milliseconds after you've pressed the button. The clock hand stops in a random location, and we're going to ask people, where was the clock when you pressed the button? In one block of trials, and in another block of trials, where was the clock when you heard the beep? And from this very, very simple set of when judgments, you can actually work out quite a lot about how people are getting the sense of controlling the beep, controlling the world, transforming their environment, albeit in this very simple way. And the phenomenon I want to tell you about, we've called intentional binding, and I'll explain it quite slowly. We start off with a block of trials where you're watching this clock go round and you make no action at all. You just hear a beep that occasionally happens. And you have to report, using the position of the rotating clock hand, when you think you heard the beep. And interestingly, people often think they heard the beep before it actually happened. If you plot these things on a timeline, we can go into that. It's not particularly essential now. What is essential is that we have another block of trials where you press the button anytime you feel like it, and 250 milliseconds later, you cause the beep. So you're the agent. And we ask exactly the same question. When do you think you heard the beep? And we compare the perceived time of the beep when you are the agent with the perceived time of the beep which just happens when you're not. So notice this baseline condition without agency, which is always used and subtracted from the perceived time of the action, perceived time of the beep, which you make happen. So what we're actually going to analyze is this perceptual shift in the perception of the outcome because I made it happen. We can do exactly the same now for the actions. So here we have a situation where we have a block of trials where I press the button anytime I feel like it and nothing happens, and I'm asked to report the perceived time of my action. It's probably a little bit before I press the button. We can go into that if you're interested. But the crucial comparison is with a block of trials where I press the button and I produce a beep. So I've changed the world. There we are. That was lucky. Good timing. And once again, we get a shift in the perceived time of the action, but now notice it's in the opposite direction. Now the action is shifted towards the beep. So, putting all of that together, in reality, action and beep are separated by 250 milliseconds. We have individual baseline estimates for the judgments of each action event and beep event, which are shown by these dashed lines. And the critical thing that we're interested in is how does the perceived time of action shift when we produce beeps, and how does the perceived time of beep shift when we make them with our actions. And what you can see is that the action shifts towards the beep and the beep shifts towards the action. Although we don't directly measure this interval, what seems to happen is that the mind is saying, put together the action and the beep, perceive them, link them as an associated pair. I did that. This is exactly what somebody like David Hume, for example, and the tradition of associationism in philosophy would predict for the sense of agency. It's some sort of link between my action and the outcome. Now, the interesting thing here is this is all completely implicit. All we're asking people to do is judge when things happen. We're not asking them, did you make the beep? Is that your beep? How do you feel about the beep? Do you like it? None of that. We're just asking people when they have experiences. So there seems to be something about the mental construction of time which is linked to agency. Now, in order to prove that, we obviously need a control condition, which is non-agency. And the way that we do that is with transcranial magnetic stimulation. So here is a younger me and my then postdoc holding a coil, an electromagnetic coil over my left motor cortex, which can be activated by discharging a capacitor here in this unit, and the magnetic field passes through the skull and causes the firing of neurons in the motor cortex and produces a twitch movement of the right hand. Same muscles that I would use to voluntarily press the button, but a completely involuntary movement. So it looks a little bit like that, and it's an interesting feeling because your hand moves and you think, it's not me, it's him who's doing that. So it's not, you don't have the feeling of controlling your action. It's a strange experience. Now, the interesting, I think I have a video of this, but I don't think I have time to show it. So the important point here, I've shown you already the action and the beep separated by 250 milliseconds. I've shown you that when we make a voluntary action, there's a perceptual compression of action and beep. But in this crucial involuntary control condition, you don't get any perceptual attraction. Actually, what happens is you get a perceptual repulsion. So the perceived time of the twitch is pushed away from the beep, and the perceived time of the beep is pushed away from the twitch. As if the mind is sort of saying, oh, Patrick, don't be fooled, that wasn't you. You know, there's no link between that twitch and that beep. It's that crazy guy with a coil over your head who is making all this happen, and you're not in control of this. Okay? So there's something about my voluntary actions which structures my subsequent temporal experience of the world. Now, we know a little bit about the brain mechanism which does this binding and which I think is linked to the sense of agency. It's got a frontal, subcortical to medial frontal pole, if you like, and it's also got a parietal aspect. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over those demonstrations, which are just really trying to show the brain mechanism which performs this binding. Perhaps we can come back to it. And I'm going to go straight more to the topic of our meeting today. So what has this cold, implicit measure of perceptual temporal association between action and outcome, what has it got to say about any of the things that we're here to talk about and that we really care about? Well, here's a first experiment done by Michiko Yoshie in my lab a couple of years ago, which is just a very straightforward intentional binding experiment where we have a condition exactly as before, where you press a button and you hear a beep, and you get a binding of the action towards the beep and a binding of the beep back towards the action. So this is a standard effect that I've shown you before. For some reason that I'm not quite sure about, it's got much stronger over the years. So the experiments that we've been doing in 2013 seem to show a lot more intentional binding than the experiments we did back in 2002. I don't know why. Normally effects go down over time. This one seems to be going up. The important point about her experiment is she had another block of trials where you press the button and you get a valenced sound. This is a human vocalization of joy or happiness. So it sounds a little bit like, ah, it's rather nice. So you press the button and you hear this nice sound. And the important point is that you get stronger binding of the action towards the happy sound and stronger binding of the happy sound back towards the action than for the neutral beep. These are horrible sounds like, ah, and you get less binding of the action towards the horrible sound and less binding of the horrible sound back towards the action. Now, this is all completely predictable. You know in each block what kind of sound you're going to get, but the critical point is that the valence of the outcome actually influences the experience of linkage between your action and the outcome that you get. And this is quite interesting because it's a completely implicit measure. Bandura has shown very clearly that there's a link between valence and agency. So if you work in a team and the team produces a fantastic paper, then it was all me. I did it. You know? Whereas if you work in a team and you produce a paper and it's rejected by all the journals, well, then it's not my fault, it's your fault. Okay? So we know that our explicit judgments of agency are very strongly self-biased and self-serving. This is suggesting that people actually experience valence as being more or less linked to the self. It's not just what they say about it. It's not just the narrative. It's actually how they experience it. Okay, so now we've heard luckily about Milgram. We've done a couple of experiments which I would say are Milgram-like. They're not Milgram experiments, but they're concerned with the same question, the same sort of questions about valence and volition. And I really moved a long way outside my comfort zone. I didn't want to do these experiments at all, but I was persuaded into doing them. This is the first time I've talked about them, so I'm going to ask the person taking the video to remove this section of the video because this is unpublished data. All right, so it's recent and interesting, rather challenging data, which was collected in my lab over the last few months. Now, a classic sort of view is that maybe people do things because they're only obeying orders. Maybe there's a kind of vicarious agency. So I'm only doing it because you told me. I don't really feel like I'm doing it. It's because somebody made me do it. So the possibility seems to be there in the literature, in the Nuremberg defense, indeed, that people seem to feel a reduced sense of agency when they obey orders. So we devised a Milgram type experiment. It's not exactly like the Milgram experiment. It had to sort of pass what I was prepared to let happen in my laboratory on my own personal ethical standards, and it also had to pass a UCL ethical committee. We have two participants who participate in dyads. They do not know each other before the experiment, and they always take turns at a punisher role and a victim role. So it's like game theory, okay? One punishes, the other is a victim, and then they swap. So it's always reciprocal. There are no confederates and there are no actors, okay? People do things to each other. The person who is the agent, that's the person here in green, has the free choice to punish the victim, or they are told in a coercive condition by an experimenter, that's this purple person, that they must punish the victim on some trials, and on other trials they are not so informed. So what you have effectively is a 2x2 design from the point of view of the agent, where they either can choose for themselves whether to punish the victim or not on every trial, and in another block of trials there's an experimenter who tells them or not on every trial, you have to be horrible to that other person. These, I should say to her, because these are always women. All the participants and experimenters are all female. And we did that because I didn't want to risk any sort of overlay of gender. Now, what we have here is, first of all, we have a slightly different way of measuring agency. Now you make an action, and after a variable delay, you hear a beep, and you have to judge how long the delay was simply by giving a verbal report. So this is what the actual delay might be within this range, and you have to say how long you think it is. You press the button, you hear the beep, and you say something like, oh, that was perhaps 438 milliseconds. You're just trying to estimate duration, and we know that agency is associated with compression of duration. Now, the beep is always present, but depending on which key the agent presses or is coerced by the experimenter by being told to press, the participant might the victim might lose money or they might not. So these are experiments where there are financial punishments which the agent inflicts on the victim. Okay, so I can choose whether to steal your money or not. Okay? And what I want to draw your attention to is, so these are the trials, I'll just go back a bit. These are the trials where I chose to steal your money, the agent chooses to steal money, and these are the trials where they don't. So this is sort of being nasty, and this is being less nasty. So what we've got here on the y-axis is how long people think the delay between action and beep is. So a small number is our proxy for a strong sense of agency. This is the free condition where the experimenter is actually not paying attention to the participants, and this agent chooses to punish the victim. And they have a stronger sense of agency, a reduced perception of the interval between action and beep compared to the coercive condition where the experimenter tells them, you must press the key, which causes her to lose money. And that's true both in the case where they actually press the key which causes the loss of money, which delivers the financial punishment, and also when they choose to press the key which does not have that consequence. So the point here is, if we accept this perceptual compression of time as being a proxy measure of the sense of agency, time seems to go faster when you freely choose than when you're told what to do, even when what you do is horrible or less horrible, and even when you're punishing somebody else. So what that seems to suggest is that in this coercive condition, people do not experience a strong sense of agency compared to free conditions. They actually don't experience such a strong linkage between what they do and what happens. do really seem to be able to distance themselves from the agency when the experimenter says, you steal her money. In the second experiment, the people deliver painful shocks to each other. Okay? So we know that each person is wearing a set of electrodes, and there's the shock stimulator here. These are real shocks, they're not fake shocks. This is a real commercial stimulator. The shocks cause a flinching reaction, and the participants can see that they're actually inflicting pain on each other. Crucially, it's reciprocal. So first I shock you, and then you shock me, so at least we both know what we're doing. Perhaps it's a little bit like a zero-sum game. There are lots of other situations in society where you have to have things like that. So this is actually infliction of moderate pain on people. And once again, you have an action which is always followed by a beep. And on some of the beeps, there's a shock. And on some of the beeps, there's no shock. And in the free condition, the agent can choose whether to deliver shocks to the victim or not. And interestingly, very often they do. One might ask why. So some people deliver a lot of shocks, some people deliver rather few, but people do it. I can go into the reasons why later. In the coercive condition, the experimenter says, you must shock her on this trial. And on another condition, the experimenter might say, you don't need to shock her on this trial. So once again, I, as the agent, am choosing to inflict pain on you. Sometimes I choose to do it, sometimes I don't choose to do it. And in another block of trials, a third party makes me punish you and cause pain. So once again, we're looking at interval estimates. So this is the perceived interval between the action and the beep in milliseconds, and a small number would be a proxy for a good sense of agency, and a large number for a less developed or less elaborated sense of control over the beep and the shock. So what you can see is in the free choice condition, people feel a greater sense of agency, implied by the fact that they perceive the interval between what they do and what happens as shorter than in the coercive blocks. So there's something about being coerced by this experimenter saying, you shock her, which actually does produce a different experience of agency, as if people are subjectively able to distance themselves from this unpleasant event that they're causing to the victim because the experimenter has told them to do it. Now, this was absolutely actually not what I wanted to find at all. I find it really rather scary. I find it rather scary that the implicit experience that we can have of causing harm to other people really does seem to be less agentic simply because somebody else made me do it. So this was, I suppose, I would have been happy if I hadn't found this result, but I found it. And I found it across two experiments, one with financial punishment and one with painful shock punishment. And now I suppose I need to work out what to do. But what we seem to find from this data so far is that coercion by a third party to inflict harm seems to reduce sense of agency, at least as we measure it with this proxy. It seems to alter our awareness of what we're doing. Itzhak asked me to talk about reflection. Well, all I can say is that this is an implicit measure, so this doesn't seem to require any reflection about agency. We're not asking people what they feel about what they're doing. We're just asking them to report when they think things happen. And importantly, we get this both in the trials where you do actually inflict pain and in the trials where you don't. So it's not related to the outcome, it's related to the mode of decision making. Okay, so not pleasant and not in fact what I predicted, but that's what the experiment showed. Now, can I end, I haven't been watching the time, but I've got about another minute in which I want to say something about violence and social management of agency. So I think the sense of agency is a nearly universal and rather direct experience. I think if a rat in a Skinner box could watch the clock going round and say when it experienced pressing the lever and say when it had experienced getting the food pellet, I think it would show intentional binding. I think it links action and outcome. So I think the sense of agency is something which probably other animals have. I think we just have it to a very developed extent, and we can tell experimenters about it and tell each other about it. So I think sense of agency is something which is pretty widespread. Interestingly, if you deny having a sense of agency, you can't be guilty of a crime, at least in England. Right? If you say, oh, I have no experience of my own agency, then you can be found criminally insane, but you can't be found guilty, at least as I read the legal documents. So we have a universal experience of agency, but the problem is that this universal capacity of the human brain, which I think is linked to the medial frontal and the parietal cortex, is also modulated or linked to general processes of understanding, the ability to understand the world and the ability to change the world through one's agency. And it's also linked to our affect. It's also linked to our perception of value, of what's good and what's bad. And what this means is that the universal direct experience of being able to change the world, make beeps happen, cause pain, or whatever, the experience of being able to make things happen, is subject to this much more cognitive system, which is highly plastic, highly Quinean, to use the philosophical term, highly contextual and highly suggestible. So I can change the way that people understand the world if I educate them in a particular way, and I can change their affects by rewarding them for particular activities or not. So what this means is that the sense of agency has the advantage that it has allowed the human brain to strongly transform the environment. That's why we have civilization, at least in a very different way from other animals. But it also makes the brains vulnerable to perversion of affect because of this strong link here, and cultural misdirection because of, well, I put these words in scare quotes, because of this strong link here. So just to end with some possible conclusions. Well, one possible conclusion might be that cultural education, in other words, if you like, social organization of the way we understand the world, might be one possible defense against misuse of agency, against violent agency. And possibly this works rather well within a group because you can choose, or groups of people choose how they educate their children, for example. It doesn't work so well between groups because there are sets of people whose education we can organize, and there are other sets of people whose education we cannot fully organize. Thank you very much for your attention.